Hi everyone and welcome. In this video, we'll talk about forms in more detail. We'll discuss form widgets, form context, and form attributes, and learn to configure interaction between the form and the end user. Let's talk about forms. A form is an application object used in a process to interact with application users. In an application, forms make up its interface. The platform has a graphic form editor where you can build forms using graphic elements, configure these elements' properties, and model their behavior when the user interacts with the form. Each form consists of widgets. In addition to simple widgets, it can also include the content of other forms, which are called nested forms in this case. Let's take a look at this questionnaire form. This form contains several blocks, such as personal client data, photo, document information, address, and so on. Each block represents a pre-made form. For example, the personal data form contains a set of widgets that display personal data of a client. To build a form, we have to use the element palette. Here, we can find all widgets that can be added to the form. For example, different captions and titles, input fields for different data types, such as numeric input field, sum input fields with a template or validation, various drop-down lists, checkboxes, radio buttons, widgets for entering time and date, buttons, tables, lists, various containers, attachments, pop-up windows, trees, and graphic elements. To add a widget to the form, select it in the palette and drag and drop it to the needed position. After it's been added, select it on the form and you will see its configuration panel open on the right. Here we can set its properties, change its appearance, and add events to configure its behavior on the form. Let's move to the training application. In the last lecture, we created a process with form blocks. Technically, these form blocks link the process and the forms. When this is the case, we must ask ourselves how the contexts interact with each other. For example, we know that the context of a process is a set of its attributes. In the same way, a form has its own context, which is the set of this form's attributes. If a form has strict context, it can only see and use its own attributes. On the contrary, if strict context is disabled, the form can access attributes of its parent process or parent form directly. It is highly recommended to create forms with strict context. It allows for encapsulating them, which makes it easier to maintain them and reuse them in different parts of the application. To create a form, click on the plus icon on the object toolbar and select Form in the menu. In the creation window, specify its location and name and make sure that all the needed checkboxes are selected. Click Save. After that, the newly created form will appear in the object tree and the form editor will automatically open on the right. To create a form attribute, open the Attributes tab on the right and click Create on the toolbar. In the creation window, enter the attribute name and select one of the data types. It can be a simple type, a reference to an existing UDM type or classifier, or a UDML expression. An attribute can be a collection, which means that it can contain multiple values, and it can also be marked as an input one. In this case, it can receive values from outside application objects and pass values to them. For example, it can receive a value from an attribute of a process or another form. After clicking Save, the new attribute appears on the list. The difference between process attributes and form attributes is that process attributes are stored in the database, while form attributes are not. Therefore, when editing a form, for example, adding and reconfiguring widgets, adding attributes, and so on, restarting the application is not required. Let's configure Form 1 to display data of clients from the clients type in a table. In Platform, tables are created using the Grid widget. To add a table, select the Grid widget in the element palette and drag it to the form. Now let's configure its properties. It is recommended to change system names of edit widgets to something meaningful that will somehow reflect the function. For example, let's name this one Grid Clients. Also, change its label. This is the title the widget will have on the form. Now, let's configure this table's content. The Grid widget has a property called Columns that is responsible for that. Clicking on its value field opens the Grid editor. At the top of the window, select the type whose objects will be used in the table. In this case, it's type clients. In the collection of objects property, specify the search method that will define which objects in particular will be displayed. For example, it can be all of them, or only ones with certain attribute values, etc. The search method specified here can be either standard or created manually in the target type. Now let's add columns. To create a column, click on the green plus icon at the bottom. On the right side, select its value. This column is supposed to display the last name of a client, so we select attribute last name. As you can see here, other property values got filled in automatically. Number 2 is a column to display the client's gender. For that, select gender as its value. Note that this is a reference to a classifier, therefore we need to specify the classifier that will be used as the source of values. Number 3 is a column for displaying the client's contacts. Note that this is a reference to a type. As you can see, there is a set of additional parameters that can be used to configure the column display. In this case, we'll use the F button, which stands for function. In the editor, let's set a complex expression. To do this, we'll use the text function. The text function takes several input parameters. In the first parameter, specify a collection of objects. In this case, it will be contacts.value. However, here, instead of the form attribute, we need to use the word record, which is an iterator that allows for addressing a specific field of a client object. Specify the second parameter. The third parameter is a delimiter between the collection objects. Click Save. Save the form. Now, let's go to the form runner and see how the table looks in the launched application. As we can see, the table displays clients, their genders, and contacts. Everything is configured properly. Now, let's have a look at the search method previously created in the clients type. As you might remember, this search method searches for clients by phone number and returns the clients whose phone number, at least one of them, matches the input value. Let's configure the form so that we can search for clients by phone number in the table. For that, let's insert an additional text field above the table. In this field, we will enter the target phone number, change its system name, and label. This widget has the value property. This property is designed to either display or update data in its widget. To work with this property, we'll create a special string attribute, phone number. To connect this attribute with the value property, click the F button. In the editor, specify the phone number attribute. This way, the value entered in the field will be passed to this form attribute. Let's also add a button that will start the search. Change its system name and label. Here, we need to change the value of its sendForm property from commit and submit to no, so that we can stay on the form and continue working with it. Save the form. Now we need to somehow process the action of the user clicking this button. For that, go to the Events tab. Each form widget has its own set of available events. Each event represents either a user action or a system action on the form. Right now, we want to configure a button click. Therefore, we'll select the onClick event. When the event is selected, we are directed to the Diagram form tab. A form diagram allows for processing user actions on the form and can contain multiple scenarios for various actions. We have already added the needed event. Now, on the Elements tab, we can select methods or add scripts that must be executed when this event occurs. In our case, we need to reload the table to update its content. As a next step, we need to configure the table so that its data is filtered based on the entered number. For that, we need to change the search method from all to the by number search method. However, we know that this method takes one input parameter. Therefore, we need to open the editor, select the search method, and in the brackets, specify the phone number form attribute. This is the attribute that will store the value entered in the search field. Save changes in the editor, and then save the form. Let's check how the form works in the form runner. As you can see, now, apart from the table, we have an input field and a button. Enter a phone number in the field and click Search. Table data got filtered, and now it only displays the client with a specified number. If we enter a non-existent number, the table will display nothing. To display all clients again, leave the input field empty and click the Search button. Let's configure one more case, so that the client selected from the table is saved to the client form attribute. Since the table is bound to the client's type, each table row represents an object of this type. As well as the text field, the grid widget also has the value property, which either displays or updates its data. Here, we need to specify the client form attribute. To make sure that the selected client is stored in the form attribute, we'll add a display field below the table and configure it to show this client's last name. For that, in the value property of the display field, specify the expression client form dot last name. Remember to change its system name and label. The last thing we need to configure is the action of selecting a client from the table and reloading the display field to update its data. For that, select the table and add the onItemClick event. After the client is selected, it's necessary to save the widget so that the selected value is recorded to the form attribute. Here, add the forceSave grid method to the diagram. Finally, add the reload method for the display field. Save the form and go to the form runner to check its performance. Select a client from the table. We can see that the display field was reloaded and now contains the last name of the selected client. If we select a different client, the display field is reloaded again and now contains a different last name. Let's return to the form diagram and talk about it in more detail. At the moment, it contains two events, onClick for the button and onItemClick for the table. If needed, you can add other events of widgets or the form itself. Apart from properties and methods that can be executed after a certain event is activated, you can also add a form script or a server script. A form script entails the functionality of all those green blocks. It allows for using form attributes and variables, as well as methods and properties of the form and its widgets. A server script is a UDMS editor where you can use the JavaScript syntax, write complex expressions, use custom functions, UDML functions, form attributes, search methods, etc. Each event or method can contain multiple outgoing transitions. In each transition, you can set an expression based on which it should be followed. In the transition editor, you can also address widget methods and properties, as well as form attributes and variables. Note that when a form attribute is referenced, an additional request is sent to the server. Therefore, it's recommended to minimize using the form.attr expression and use form variables instead. This way, we configure interaction between the application and the user. This brings us to the end of this video. Today, we have learned more about forms, their widgets and attributes, and also learned to configure interaction between the form and the end user.